All right, hey, welcome back to the Peanut Gallery.
Welcome back to the Peanut Gallery. Here we are once again.
Here we are, 27 episodes in.
Yeah, and for today, something a little bit different. You've, by all accounts, have done 24 out of the 27 episodes of sitting in,
and has worn his Blue Jay hat in every single one,
except for one, right? I think,
except for maybe one or two.
I think except for one or two. Yeah, you're very consistent. People think that we just film these all at once because you're in the same outfit.
In my defense, we typically record these Monday, and Monday is pretty we're tired. It's been the weekend. It's the one day I work, so you guys can all make that joke and we can laugh.
Yeah, Sundays are the one days that pastors work. Yeah.
So anyways, by Mondays, so I don't feel like getting up and getting dressed. Anyways. So that's why I wear my hat, and you guys can stop bugging me about it because the Jays are going to pick up some good guys in the deadline, and we're going.
They need some pitching, yeah,
desperately.
Yeah, if they could get George Springer, if someone could figure out how to hook up George Springer with a fastball revealing device to help him so that he can hit better.
If we could help our pitcher,
if somebody could help him with that would be great. But we want to do something different today. We want to give people an opportunity to get to know. You. You're the main interviewer that's been, I know, and a little bit about the Peanut Gallery, a little bit of history about where it's at. But I mean, people are starting to recognize your voice as you walk through a community.
That was funny though. That was hilarious. So we were at No Frills.
Okay, I haven't heard this story.
Yeah, so we're at No Frills and I'm working there. There's a cashier there, and I don't completely recognize the person. But anyways.
Which is strange in a small town.
They asked, they're like, you go to Mount Salem Church? And I'm like, yes. And she's like, I recognized your voice. And I was like, oh, snap. So now I have to start being a lot more careful what I say in places. Either that or is my voice that annoying? I find it nasally. I find it very nasally.
Right now in the Alma community, it's when somebody says, I recognize your voice from church, it's always like, you want to be careful about that. But we want to talk a little bit about why the Peanut Gallery, why we're here, how did this happen, some of the things that have been learned through the first 20, we're on episode 27, which is pretty crazy. But can you tell us, maybe why the Peanut Gallery? Why did this thing start? Why did we start rolling with this?
Well, we've been saying this for years. So if you guys follow us, period, and obviously we're pastors, and so we spend a lot of time talking. But one of the things we've been discussing quite a bit is people's inability to have good conversation. This is a huge issue. This is when you look at a lot of the struggles culture is facing, period, whether it's cancel culture, the woke stuff, endless different issues we're facing. Even if you look at, what's happening with residential schools now, people don't know how to actually converse because we're all scared of saying the wrong thing. And so you end up with a place where nobody talks. And then when somebody does talk, if you don't agree with them, our tendency is to just blast each other.
Yeah. Have you noticed, for me, I've noticed an increasing, the volume on this has been going up and
100%.
up and up over from what I can feel the last decade.
100%.
It just seems like it's getting crazy.
Well, you know what I honestly think it is though? I think people are tired of seeing people hurt. And I think at the core of this, I know a lot of it gets slammed, but I think at the core of it, people are tired of hearing stories of people hurting. And it's to a point where we're now frustrated because we don't know how to solve it. We've mentioned on this podcast before, we've often mentioned when we're preaching, it's absolute insanity that we're still treating people differently based on a color of skin. How can we possibly still be here? And I think that's a big underlying thing of going and this is where you're seeing a lot of the extreme attempts to force people to change, because people are how are we still dealing with this? How are we still hurting people this way? And so I think underlying a lot of it is good. I think people are tired of seeing pain. And they're just not sure where to turn. They're not sure how to solve the problems. And that's where the volume keeps getting louder and louder. And now I think people are just starting to turn on each other. And so I think that's where you're seeing, it's more in the States. They seem to be a little more loud. I think in Canada, we're much more passive aggressive.
We always say that in Canada, right? But the truth is, I think you said it yourself. Yeah. We're very passive aggressive. 100%. So it's not like we're not like the U.S. We just like to be the quiet, better perceived partner or neighbor to the north. But we can be quite loud and aggressive ourselves. It just doesn't come across the same way.
Yeah, we think we're better then because of that.
Yeah.
Because we only think the thoughts in our head and then passively kind of do stuff. We're better, right?
So it's only them that act on it.
So those conversations, and be very clear, the podcast isn't just me. It's the three of us working. I end up sitting in this chair a little bit more. But a lot of us work at this together. But we really, a big part of it is that conversation piece and going, how do we get to know each other again? I think one of the biggest things for me, at least coming out of this, in lessons learned, and I know this maybe isn't answering your question fully, but I think listening. And I think the challenge that we have to listen to each other has been incredible in our culture. And as much as social media is awesome, as much as the internet is awesome, I think our lack of listening to each other, even texting, it doesn't give you that conversation. It's quick. You're guessing tone. You're guessing all this other stuff. And so I think one of the biggest things coming out of this when you listen, I mean, if you've listened to all 27, they are incredible stories.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are just a few people. And then you begin to go and you begin to ask more people about their stories and what they've gone through. And I think that's been our goal with this. Can we solve the whole world? I mean, we know we can't, but I think in our little region, our goal was, I want you to get to know people, and I want you to begin to understand that the people in your region are going through things, and people are hurting, and people have gone through things, but not just the negative. You know, we talked about we don't know where to turn to. You think about this last episode with Bill Friesen, which was one of my favorites, mainly because of my connection to Bill. But to watch him recover, to watch him go through what he did, man, that story, there's power there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if he can get through that, if he can still, carry on in this struggle, then whatever we're facing as a culture, as a community, we can also. And so I think some of them were unintended consequences of what we're doing here that we didn't know would turn out that way.
Right.
But I think going back to it was the conversation piece. I want to talk about things. I want to be able to give people the opportunity to share opinions and learn that we can still love each other even if we see things a little bit differently.
So not the typical thing that you would see on most mainstream media where people are just shouting over each other.
Right.
Instead of actually listening to what the person said, asking questions about what they've said, responding with some thoughts and seeing if they can figure out exactly what the person's meaning. Because a lot of times it seems like inside of even just like what we see on TV, they're sitting down for 5-10 minutes, but they're not even actually like having a conversation. They're not even discussing the question that gets answered. They're not even approaching, it's so meaningless in that 5 minutes. And it's like, well, if I can just shout over you, or if I can just make sure that what I wanted to, drop on your table and then walk away gets left there for everybody to see. But it's so devoid of connection. And that just, from what I remember in our conversation, it drove us nuts.
It's like talking to your kid and they just keep repeating the same. No matter what you say, they just keep, no. Well, have you thought about this? No. Have you are you even listening? 100%. You see that all over the place. And I think that's part of the challenge. So going into that, Patrick, I think one of the things that so if we want to talk about conversations and the whole yelling and screaming, trying to figure out how to have those conversations without it becoming that has been really hard. So one of the conversations I would really like to have is on abortion. I think abortion is a topic that people just scream about. I'd like to understand, because where my stance is different, I want to understand how people got to the other stance.
Right.
And I think we're missing that, but it seems so hard.
And right away, the difficulty is, okay, number one, you want to have that conversation, but here's the difficulty. You're a man. So right away, can you have that conversation?
Right.
And I feel like the answer should be yes, but from the outside, we're told no.
Right.
And why can we not engage in a conversation when the purpose of that is to actually learn how we got to where we're at and why we got to where we're at, not even for the purpose of necessarily changing where we're at, but even just to gather the steps that it took to get to the place where we're at, because we weren't there when it happened.
Right.
So how do we fully understand why we got there? Because that story matters.
Right.
And if we don't know that story, then we end up with, again, just speaking to a wall and not really actually engaging in a connective conversation to even understand your heart of why you think the way you think and why I think the way I think. And is there a common ground there? And I think the worst part is I think even like today, I think if we were actually to talk, we would find a lot more common ground
100%.
than what we want to admit to, which is a weird thing because we don't want to admit that we have common ground with somebody that we're supposed to be opposing.
Right. But the only way you get there is through that conversation. And that is what we have constantly been trying to figure out. How do we have this? Because I want to learn, I want to see, I want to understand. Obviously, we have our morals as Christians. I just think we scream too much.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm going to pick on Christians because that's who I am. But I think in general, what we're seeing around the world is there's just a lot of people yelling at each other. And we felt like in our tiny little region here, we wanted to try to find a way to tell stories and have conversations.
So Aylmer, Malahide, Elgin.
Yeah, even when we boost posts, we tried to keep it local. And I think that's one of the other things I wrote down when you were asking me what the stuff was. We've tried really hard not to try to become big in the sense of, I don't care to go viral because I really want this to be about my little community.
Right.
These are the people that, I've given my life to, that have many of whom that, we've had on here have given their whole life to. And I think about, Scott Lewis's comments on community. We have reflected on that so many times, and the way he talked about the value of owning a piece of property, and then the ownership you need to have, and what you're responsible for that. And so that's where I think sometimes we get caught up in trying to go global and changing the whole world when we stop to just, maybe our job is to just be good here in Malahide and make a difference in Malahide and Aylmer, and what that's going to look like. I don't know in the next couple of years, but I think some of these issues, my kids are asking me questions about this. I want to be able to say, hey, here's a good conversation to understand what the other side of what you think this issue is. And so even if at the end you can disagree, we can at least go, look, I understand where you're coming from.
So you've done a lot of interviews. I mean, people might look at it and go, well, it's only been, 24 different people that but 24 interviews where you're sitting down, you're having to face, there's been a range of emotions that have happened at this table in the past number of months. I mean, very difficult conversations, heart-wrenching conversations, grief, loss, sorrow. There's been episodes that I've gone home and I've listened to and just cried.
Yeah,
just cry. I don't even know how to handle the emotions that I'm hearing, and then knowing the people that those emotions are coming from have been very hard. Tell us maybe a little bit of maybe some of those conversations and what ones have spoken to you. I mean, we could say the most, but what has impacted you the most about some of the conversations that you've had as you've sat and you've talked to people, and maybe go through the process of how difficult it is in the middle of an interview to be trying to be able to stay connected, but as you're thinking in your head about your own family, your own kids, your own spouse, your own future, and what it would feel like, as you feel empathy for the person across the table from you. What are some of those moments that you've had that you've just been kind of like, okay, can we pause here? Because none of as far as what I know, we don't edit.
No.
Our podcast here.
No.
We don't. There's not cutting and pasting.
Yeah.
Everything is live and it's non-edited. This is the conversation we're having because we wanted to be as real as we could
and
be.
it's not scripted. Same as today. There's a few questions, kind of this is the general direction we're going, and we're 13 minutes in and we have not gone the direction that we thought, because it's conversation. You can't have conversation if you're going to script. So, so I would say what has been really hard for me is listening and thinking at the same time.
Yeah.
So when you're having a conversation or a debate with somebody, you want to be ready with something when they stop. But the only way you can do that is to not listen. Right?
Yeah. And it's very hard.
And so when you're talking about, those kind of, where they're just yelling back and forth, well, a big part of that is the fact that they haven't actually listened to anybody else in the panel. And so I have found that to be incredibly hard. And so for me, especially with stories, and I think one of the first ones that was incredibly tough was Sarah Dyke coming on talking about losing Veronica. And I had never even heard that full story.
No.
And so incredibly moved. And I'm sitting there listening and tearing up. And then all of a sudden she stops talking. I'm like, oh crap, now it's my turn. I'm supposed to say something. And I don't know how obvious it is to everyone else. I think when you've done, speaking in general for a long time, you pick up on things more. When I watch myself, I can always tell where my brain was like, geez. And it's hard because you really get caught up in the stories. And so I think my favorites have been the moments where I think people have been able to articulate a story that they haven't been able to tell before. And I think, when Sarah told her story and having people come up and say, we had no idea. after Josh told his story, then having Dave Miller shoot me a call and go, hey, I need to tell my story. And I think that's been by far the most enjoyable part of this, is giving people a platform to tell their story. And the impact it's had on us has been incredible. Like, I have left so many of these just going, I am so incredibly moved. I am so incredibly thankful. I'm so incredibly, all these other range of emotions. After listening to Josh, as you take stock of what you have and you go, man, how lucky am I?
Yeah.
And you come home and you hug your kids a little bit tighter, and then you listen to Dave, and then you think of, Bill and Sarah losing kids. And so it's been those conversations that I think culture needs to hear.
Do you think, something, again, not scripted at all. So my brain's going to try to put together this question, and I don't know if it'll make any sense, but I'm going to try anyway.
That's all right. We'll be the first one we edit it out.
Yeah,
it's
we'll
fun.
see if we do some editing. But in a society, a culture, a people that have so much information available at their fingertips, and being an information, like, I love consuming information. I do. But what I found through the process of listening to people's stories is that there's a different level of information that's being told. And I have found the depth of information, and by that I mean not just the story, but the life that went through the story and how it's being told to you, to be so much more meaningful in terms of, like, I feel like listening to that type of a story is so much more, there's a part of me that just feels so much more grown, because I feel like I know somebody at a level it's different than reading a book about a topic. Now I've actually, I've been in the presence of someone's life. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like, it's just different. How is that type of, those types of, like, the time that you're spending in front of people, how has that impacted you on that level? Like, in terms of the value and the worth that you're getting from those moments in life where you're sitting in the chair and you're just kind of like, well, that was like, because I feel like when you listen, or you're sitting here in this room, we get done and it's like the most meaningful hour of time that I could have spent ever. Like, it's just like, that was just so, like, that person basically just shared themselves.
Right.
And it was so intimate.
Right.
Like, to use a word that it's misused. How do you feel about that in terms of what it's brought to your life, your family, you as a parent, you as a dad, you as a pastor? How has it impacted you that way?
I think the best way I would say is every story has reminded us that there's hope. I think we live in a culture where, when I think about, again, Bill and Sarah's story, statistically, after a child dies, you divorce.
Yeah.
And the stories, and I don't want to make that any light phrase. That statistically just is, because it is such a incredibly hard thing to go through. And so then when I listen to Bill talk, and I listen to him talk about the challenge, and I listen to him share about the journey, but not to end with hopelessness.
Right.
But to say, no, but there is hope. Yeah, I regret some of these decisions. Yes, some of this is hard. Some of this I wish I could have done different. But there's hope, and I'm moving forward day by day. I think the ability to gain hope from people's stories. I think our culture right now, especially with COVID, with everything, there's so much hopelessness. And again, that goes back to the cancel culture of people. They don't see that racism can end. They don't see that hatred can end. And so then they just begin to just go off. Yeah. And these stories, they just remind me that, again, there's hope. And the other thing it does, I think, is it reminds me that there's just really good people.
Yeah.
Listening to some of these, there's just some great people in our community. Wow. And they're not all Christians. This is, when you go back through this stuff that, the majority of the people have been on here, people that we know, and they're Christians, but they're not all.
Right.
And there are great people in our community who aren't necessarily from this church, and they do see things differently. And I think we need that. I think we need to
amazing people, like the people you don't hear, the people you didn't know impacted that. Like, the person's story a little bit, but you didn't know about the aunt or the uncle or that neighbor that spoke into that person's life
Right.
or came alongside them and that person and the impact that they had, and you have no idea.
Yeah.
But now you've seen, oh, there was
Yeah.
somebody out there that had somebody's back and loved somebody
Yeah.
in a moment where nobody else was loving them.
Right.
Like that's wild.
Yeah.
Like but that tells me how many more of those people are out there.
Yep.
Because everybody seems to have somebody in their story that's like that.
Well,
And
this is the danger with the news and social media, and a lot of that is you get such a false view of reality. You know, when I click on the news, so much of it is dark. But you know, I interviewed Scott. He was amazing.
Yeah.
I thought we were just going to talk about cars. I had no idea I would be inspired about community listening to my mechanic.
I know, right?
'Cause we didn't know.
It was so powerful.
So then you begin to go, okay, well, we need to have more of this because there are incredible people in our world. And we can't get sucked into that cynical, our world sucks, it's all going to end, it's all sad, and I think that's part of my issue with conspiracy theories is because they're all based on fear.
Right.
They're all based on fear that everything's going to hell in a handbag. And then you look around, you go, man, there's just so many good people. And I think if we can, through this, provide hope, if we can somehow give people the energy to go, oh man, my life sucks right now and I'm hating what I'm going through. But man, listening to Bill or listening to Scott or listening to Sean or Anita or listening to Brent and Susanna. You know, that was one highlight I did want to bring up was Susanna, the one thing she said in there, she said, I called my sister up and we just cry. And she says, can you cry with me? That moment I was, right? But I've thought about that so much now, just the ability to feel with each other. And so I think as we tell these stories, I'm hoping we can do that for others. That yeah, maybe, you know, I don't want to give this false illusion that life's going to be perfect and grand. Maybe you will end up with a child that dies. Maybe you will end up in a divorce. Maybe you will end up in a situation you don't want, but don't let that be your whole life story. Don't let that be the end. There's always hope that we can move towards a brighter future. And I think if we can instill that in our little community, in our culture, then we've accomplished what we're hoping out of the Peanut Gallery. If people finish listening to these episodes and they've either laughed or cried or been moved, my biggest goal is that they've been encouraged and that they've found another grain of hope to keep pushing on, to keep trying, to keep, you know, pouring into our community because there's so many incredible people who are resilient through incredible. Okay, so if Brent and Susanna can handle that,
Yep.
if Bill can handle that, then that gives me hope for my situation, right?
Yeah. I'm just thinking about in my head, like you start saying, like, I just call my sister and cry.
Yeah.
Like I'm right there.
Yep.
Like I'm like, whoo, I want to cry.
Right.
Because I can see that happening. Like
Yep.
that's a real,
Right.
like, that's real. That's,
Yep.
you can touch that. Most people can, in their life, draw on a moment where, you know, the sister in that story is a hero.
Right.
Because you are being what you need to be in that moment for that person who needs a shoulder.
Right.
And powerful. So
I just think sometimes we try too hard to avoid those moments and fix all those circumstances instead of just entering them.
right.
I'm going to come alongside you and I'm going to grieve. I hate cancer. I hate all these things. But I don't know how to solve that. But what I can do is I can give empathy and care and come alongside. And I don't think we do that enough as a culture. When you think about even the way we view the homeless or the way we view those with mental illness, or maybe I can't solve a Canada-wide process, but I can certainly enter that moment with empathy.
Yeah.
And I think we miss some of that. But I think, at least, that comes out of a lack of hope. Because if I think that person there's no hope for them, then I no longer have the ability to have empathy. If I can stay in a place where I say there's always hope, now I can say, okay, I'm going to empathize with you and I'm going to walk with you. And if you lose your journey to cancer, I'm going to walk with you that every single step.
Right.
And I think that's the best way to live. I think that's what community looks like. But it takes us actually listening.
So it's almost it's very similar. Like we've talked, you know, being ministers, being religious officiants. We've also talked about the importance of the reality of the vows people make when they stand before each other. And instead of just having vows that are like, and it's not a criticism to the vows that say, I want to be your best friend and
Right.
I want, you know, that's great we want those things to be present in relationship. They're important. But there's something about saying, when life gets crappy and when the times where it's going to really suck happen, because it's going to happen, because that's the human experience, I'm not going anywhere.
Right.
I'm going to walk with you through that.
Yeah, we've talked about this in the office quite a bit, and this has become my standard wedding sermon, is just to basically go over what a wedding is. And to say everything you need to survive is here. And those vows, those are a huge part of it. I mean, it's part of what makes relationships so good, is that when you go through something hard, you don't go through it alone. So I think there's incredible value in that. And I think our culture, again, divorce is going to happen.
Yep.
And we try very hard to find a way to support those whose marriages don't work. But I don't think that we can't do both. I think in the sense that you walk along couples when things don't work, but you also strive really hard to help things to work. And I don't know of anybody yet who's ever moved in together or started a relationship or got married who's been like, man, I hope we divorce and it gets ugly.
Yeah, I can't wait for
so
that.
nobody wants that.
No.
So I think we work with people in that. And I do think that's just part of, I think our culture potentially just has been so spoiled over the last, my lifetime for sure, that we just don't know how to handle adversity well. And so I think that's part of the conversation coming out of COVID. And it's part of even what we're talking about here is that I think people struggle to know how to suffer, and so then we just try to bail. And I think marriage, as it was created at least, is supposed to be that place where when everything else falls apart, when you fall apart, when you fail, when you suffer, you're not going to be alone. And I think if we can reinstill that, not just in marriage, but in our communities, even in our families, the way we treat siblings, the way we treat neighbors, the way we treat community. I would argue part of this, and I'm sure I'll get criticism if anybody listens this far, but I think that was one of the best arguments for wearing a mask, especially during the height of the pandemic. I know right now we're on the tail end and people are but during the height of it, just if for nothing else, but to say that I love my neighbor enough that if this somehow prevents them from getting ill, I can do it.
Yeah.
But that's a heart thing. That's a care thing. That's a putting the other person in front of yourself. It's a community thing.
Laying down of my personal right to make sure that I'm taking care of their right.
100%.
So tell us maybe like favorite moment. You're sitting in the chair. You're just like,
okay, well, it wasn't my favorite moment at the time, but now looking back, episode 1 with Josie. And so she already told me I'm not allowed to say this, so we're going to do it anyway, and we're going to kind of see. We're going to see how this goes. But if you look at her face, she was so mad at me. She did not want to be in here, and it was all my fault. I want to own that, Patrick, because
I believe it.
Because it was our first episode, and we were so busy, and we didn't know what this thing was going to be. But I really wanted her on, but I hadn't given her a set of questions. I hadn't given her anything because I'm just like, well, it's just me and her. Like, we'll just talk.
So if anybody knows Albert and Josie, Albert is the fly by the seat of his pants cowboy. Things are changing moment by moment by moment. There's nothing in stone. And Josie is like, okay, what's the deal? What's the plan? How are we doing this? What's the organize?
So if you watch her throughout the episode, she does this. And she's like more and more, I don't want to be here. Why am I here?
I always view that where she's got this little look in your eye like, okay, what are you going to ask me?
100%.
Because I have no idea.
And the episode turned out awesome, and it was wonderful, and it's been one of my joys, but definitely laughed afterwards. At the time, she was not happy with me, but it worked out good.
What are the prospects for having
her back on?
Yeah.
After saying this, we're a few months away.
So probably episode 100, maybe?
Yeah, maybe we can get on there for 100.
A reunion episode of some kind.
But you know what? I don't know. Like, I know you were going to ask that, and I've been trying to think. I don't know if I'd be able to nail. I think on a very personal level, I think my conversation with Bill will by far be one of my highlights. And again, I say that because watching Bill go through, being, the morning after Curtis died, walking in and being with the family for a while, seeing the impact it had on so many people in this church, being a part of the funeral. So when it's that personal and it's that close, and then having lost connection with him over the last couple of years, now being able to hear his story like that. But that's what we wanted. That was the whole goal, was to hear stories. And so I don't know if there is one that's a favorite or not. I've enjoyed it. I've loved it. Being able to have different friends on here talking about, so many different things, from trauma to opioids to just laughing, to talking with Doyle about Family Central to Jeremy. Like there's so many that. So I don't know if I would be able to. Maybe once we get to like 100 episodes or something like that, we can look back and there'll be a moment. But I think right now, what I'm the most excited about, I think, is the ability to walk through town and have people talk to me about what they've heard.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we were hoping to do was that we would not be the stars of the show. And very rarely do people talk to me about the podcast in terms of me.
Yeah, very rarely do anything that we do have any sort of views that are any sort of like, even this episode will most likely be one of the least viewed episodes.
No, but they come on, they talk, hey, I heard what Bill said, I heard what Dave said, Josh said, whatever. And they want to talk about that. And again, I think that goes back to, I'm excited that we've kind of found a groove as to where this is going and that we're sticking to that.
Yeah.
Not getting caught up in clickbaiting and trying to just make something that go crazy across Canada. Just no, these are stories. And so to me, that's been awesome. And so I'm looking forward to the next 25 and seeing what becomes of it.
I wish people would have an opportunity to, like, when the microphones are turned off.
Oh, some of the best conversations.
And it's almost like, why didn't we record that?
Well, it's because, again, this goes back to point one, and that is there's so much fear. There's so many, abortion is only one of the topics. There's multiple topics that our culture is struggling with, but nobody can say anything because everybody's terrified of saying the wrong thing. And so I think often when the mics turn off, then we can drop and we can kind of go, okay, well, how do you feel about this? And then you'll learn. And there's so much insight given. But when we're recorded on here, as we learned when we said something about a certain church to the north, good night, people get fired up, right?
Yeah.
So again, you can have conversation as long as it's safe and it doesn't offend anyone. And that's hard. And when we have guests on here, it's one thing when people throw hate at me and you. We're somewhat used to that already. We've been through a few things. But it's guests you want to protect. And so it's a challenge. And I hope one day we can change that in a culture that claims to be so free of speech. We are so not. And it's not because of policies. It's just the way we treat each other.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think at the core of part of our humanity is a fear that actually being open about who we are and what we're dealing with will leave us empty and not have a connection.
Yep.
And instead of, I think that's the hardest part, is that we all long for the connection.
Yep.
But we're afraid if we actually open up that all connections will be lost.
Right.
And again, like you said over and over again, one of our hopes and dreams was that this would be a place where you could actually build those connections. And then other people could connect into them and start sharing who they are.
Right.
And we could see community grow from there.
Right.
Well, I want to say thank you for being so willing as the lead interviewer of the Peanut Gallery podcast. Thank you for putting yourself out there. I know sitting in the chair has not been easy. There's been a lot of interviews that have been hard.
Yep.
I know they've wore on you, some of them, emotional toll. I want to say thank you for what you're doing and for building community and for allowing yourself to be interviewed here today as part of our 27th episode. 27. So thank you for joining us.
27.
Like, subscribe, and comment. Thanks for joining us today on the Peanut Gallery. Thank you so much.